The crystal chandeliers at the cliffside resort caught the light perfectly, but my eyes were fixed on the drafty service hallway. My 3 children sat at an unnumbered auxiliary table, staring at empty porcelain plates. In the main dining room, my sister Valerie took a sip of her champagne and casually announced that my children were merely guests who could eat once the actual family finished. I looked at my father, Arthur. He offered a single, approving nod. I didn't cry. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply stood up, gathered my children, and walked out into the cold night. The cold sea air whistling through the floorboards of our converted attic apartment was a familiar companion. We lived above a coastal marine supply shop, an arrangement that perfectly mirrored my position within the family structure, hovering on the periphery, completely out of sight. My 3 children, Faye, Della, and Beckett, were asleep in the adjacent room, their quiet breathing the only sound in the small space. For years, I had functioned as the silent investor in my family's emotional portfolio, continually absorbing the quiet sting of being the designated outsiders. I worked past midnight, my fingers flying across a second-hand laptop, drafting freelance technical manuals just to keep the heat running and the lights on. Every extra dollar went toward paying off the crippling medical debt from Faye's early childhood illnesses, a burden my wealthy family had explicitly refused to help with. I used to wonder why I endured the constant marginalization, the subtle ways they made sure I knew I was secondary. But chronic family exploitation does not begin with a massive explosion. It operates through the trap of cruel normalization, a psychological mechanism where systemic emotional neglect conditions you to accept mistreatment under the guise of family harmony. You are meticulously trained to view your own marginalization as the standard cost of admission to the family table. Love had been presented to me as a premium subscription, and I had been quietly footing the bill for decades. Valerie was the golden child, her life a meticulously curated asset, while I was the liability to be managed and kept out of the main dining room. But that night at the Cliffside Resort had broken the conditioning forever. Seeing Faye, Della, and Beckett relegated to a service hallway stripped away the last remnants of my tolerance. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for walking out, but there was only absolute clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I evaluated the return on investment for my continued loyalty to Arthur and Valerie, and the numbers finally made sense. The arithmetic of our survival no longer required their approval. I didn't feel despair as I compiled my invoices for the month. I felt the cold, hard precision of a ledger being balanced. If they viewed our relationship as a business transaction, it was time to officially audit the accounts. I closed my laptop, the screen reflecting my dry eyes. There would be no more waiting for an invitation to a table where we were never welcome. In the weeks following the gala, the silence from my family was absolute. There were no missed calls, no apologies, no inquiries about whether my children were all right. Instead, the retaliation arrived through a forwarded message from my Aunt Ronnie. It was a screenshot from a family group chat where Valerie explicitly accused me of orchestrating a scene to humiliate our father in front of his elite friends. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. The narrative was quickly rewritten to make me the unstable aggressor, a volatile liability that needed to be frozen out of the social accounts. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't ask why. I just opened my phone and started clicking delete. I leaned heavily into my freelance technical writing, taking on every contract I could find to keep my family afloat. Martha, the owner of the local diner and my landlord, became the quiet savior we desperately needed. She would leave surplus baking at the bottom of our stairs, her unconditional support a stark contrast to the transactional affection of my blood relatives. For so long, I had been paralyzed by the invisible chains of a survivor, trapped in a survival mindset that kept me enduring their abuse simply because it was familiar. This psychological paralysis convinces you that enduring the pain of staying is somehow safer than risking the terrifying unknown of leaving. I had fully believed the illusion that I was powerless against their influence, but watching Martha interact with Faye, Della, and Beckett, offering them warmth without demanding compliance in return, snapped the final link of that invisible chain. I realized my survival mindset had been a defense mechanism against people who were supposed to protect me, but who only viewed me as an expendable resource. I didn't need their validation or their apologies. I just needed capital to secure my children's future. I sat at my desk, typing out technical specifications for industrial machinery until 3 in the morning. I looked through the cracked doorway at my children sleeping safely. My mind wasn't cold, it was fiercely protective, completely stripped of any residual guilt. They expected me to crack, to call Arthur and beg for my place back in the margins. They expected the silence to break me into submission. Instead, the silence became my ultimate workspace. I was methodically building a firewall between my children and their toxicity. I was no longer the family charity case. I was an independent contractor, completely auditing my life and decisively severing ties with toxic assets. My freelance technical writing soon expanded into accounting and billing work for an upscale architectural salvage yard. It was tedious, methodical labor, cross-referencing old vendor invoices against current inventory logs, but it paid well. The salvage yard frequently contracted with Julian's commercial real estate group, providing antique fixtures and reclaimed materials for the high-end property developments my brother-in-law was famous for building. I was working through a massive backlog of physical files late one Thursday night, surrounded by the smell of dust and old brass, when a simple clerical error brought my world to a sudden, freezing halt. A stack of old vendor invoices had been accidentally stapled together with a series of bank wire transfer confirmations. I recognized the routing numbers immediately. They belonged to my late mother Eleanor's estate trust. The trust had been explicitly established and legally mandated to be split equally for all the grandchildren's education upon their 18th birthdays. It was money I had assumed was securely locked away for Faye, Della, and Beckett, alongside Valerie's children. I traced the printed numbers with my index finger, my breathing shallow but perfectly steady. The transfer confirmations revealed a systematic bleeding of the accounts. Over the past 4 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been quietly redirected from the educational trust into a series of corporate shell accounts. From there, the funds were funneled directly into Julian's multi-million-dollar commercial real estate expansions. They hadn't just marginalized my children at an anniversary dinner. They had actively financed their lavish lifestyle, their luxury vehicles, and their pristine social status using the legacy my mother had explicitly left for her grandchildren. The betrayal wasn't an emotional slight. It was documented felony fraud. I didn't panic. I didn't call Arthur to ask how he could have allowed this to happen under his watch. Anger was entirely absent, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously scanning, copying, and categorizing every single piece of paper in that file. I cross-referenced the exact dates of the trust transfers with the public announcements of Julian's major property acquisitions. The financial correlation was flawless. They had stolen my children's future to build an empire of glass and steel, assuming I would remain the quiet, obedient outsider who never possessed the resources or the intelligence to ask questions. They had relied on my chronic compliance as a shield for their embezzlement. They had severely miscalculated. I backed up the files to 3 separate encrypted drives. The family dynamic had officially shifted from a toxic emotional entanglement to a high-stakes legal transaction. The next morning, I did not go to the salvage yard. I drove straight to the downtown offices of Marcus Vance, a meticulous estate and trust attorney that Martha had strongly recommended. I walked into his office, taking in the leather chairs and the quiet, efficient atmosphere, with a thick binder of printed bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, and corporate registry logs under my arm. I didn't waste his time on emotional exposition or family history. I simply slid the binder across his mahogany desk and laid out the undeniable financial reality of my mother's phantom legacy. Marcus was quiet, highly professional, and razor-sharp. It took him less than 48 hours to pull the original trust documents from the county records and cross-reference them with the corporate shell accounts I had uncovered. When I returned to his office 2 days later, his expression was grave and clinical. The trust documents explicitly mandated equal distribution among all grandchildren. More importantly, any restructuring or early withdrawal of the funds required my direct, notarized authorization. Marcus placed a single piece of paper in front of me. It was a transfer authorization form, dated 3 years prior. My signature was at the bottom, flawlessly executed in blue ink, except I had never seen the document, and I had never signed it. They had even bribed a corrupt notary to illegally stamp the paperwork, completely bypassing the strict security protocols of the trust. It was a complete, calculated forgery. In that exact moment, the entire landscape of my life shifted. The conflict with my family was no longer a civil dispute over hurt feelings or a drafty auxiliary table at a luxury resort. It had officially escalated into documented felony fiduciary fraud. My father, Arthur, had been the primary legal executor of the trust. Julian and Valerie were the direct beneficiaries of the stolen funds. They were all entirely complicit in the theft. Marcus outlined our legal strategy with absolute detachment. We were not going to ask for a family meeting. We were not going to negotiate a private, quiet settlement behind closed doors. We were filing an immediate emergency injunction to freeze Julian's corporate assets, accompanied by a formal civil lawsuit for misappropriation of trust funds and forgery, while simultaneously forwarding the file to the district attorney. I authorized the filings without a single second of hesitation. There was no internal conflict. No lingering loyalty to the bloodline that had so casually betrayed my children. The legal machinery began to turn immediately. Official notices were served to Julian's corporate headquarters, to Valerie's exclusive country club address, and to Arthur's pristine suburban home. They had spent decades treating me as a silent liability they could comfortably ignore. Now, they were about to discover that I was the primary creditor they could no longer afford to dismiss. The panic on their end was immediate and absolute. Within 24 hours of the asset freeze, Julian and Valerie attempted an aggressive media spin, hiring a crisis management firm to plant stories in the local business journals. They claimed the massive transfers were merely temporary family bridge loans, an internal financial restructuring that I had somehow misunderstood due to my lack of business acumen. But PR spin holds absolutely no weight against subpoenaed banking records and forged signatures. Marcus forced them into a formal, legally recorded mediation proceeding. We sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, the geographical center of Julian's soon-to-be dismantled real estate empire. Arthur sat beside them, looking ancient, gray, and diminished. He had been the guardian of the trust, and his silent complicity revealed the institutional blind spots that protect abusers from accountability. He had allowed the theft to occur because he fundamentally believed Valerie's elite lifestyle was worth significantly more than my children's basic security. As Marcus methodically presented the forged documents and the exact tracing of the funneled funds, the reality of a world without Eleanor's protection became devastatingly clear. Without her original, ironclad trust stipulations coming to light, their unchecked exploitation would have completely erased my children's future. The undeniable proof cornered them perfectly. The bridge loan narrative collapsed entirely under the weight of the evidence. Under the relentless, clinical pressure of the documents, Valerie finally broke. It wasn't a tearful apology or a plea for family forgiveness. It was a spectacular, unhinged fit of narcissistic rage. She slammed her manicured hands on the conference table, screaming that Julian needed that capital to secure their market position. She shrieked that they had earned that money through their superior social status, through the heavy sacrifices of maintaining the family's elite image while I was just an embarrassment hiding in a drafty attic. She confessed, loudly and explicitly, that they felt entirely entitled to steal from my children because they deemed themselves more important. The court reporter's fingers flew across the stenograph machine, capturing every single unhinged, damning word. Valerie had just entered a full, voluntary confession of motive and execution directly into the legal record. Julian stared at his wife, the blood draining from his face as the realization dawned that she had just sealed their total destruction. I watched the glass-walled collapse of their manufactured superiority without a trace of emotion. I didn't interrupt her screaming. I simply sat perfectly still and let the silence of the room absorb her self-inflicted ruin. The court's ruling was swift, overwhelming, and utterly merciless. Faced with documented forged signatures and a fully transcribed confession of misappropriation, the judge stripped Julian and Valerie of every conceivable legal defense. The trust was ordered to be restored in full immediately. Furthermore, the court mandated severe punitive damages and legal fees, with penalties totaling $3.4 million. To enforce the massive judgment, Marcus secured immediate, non-negotiable liens against all of Julian's commercial real estate holdings. The financial empire they had built on stolen capital began to crumble in a matter of weeks, leading to a grueling year of liquidations. The banks aggressively called in their outstanding loans, prominent investors panicked and pulled their backing, and Julian's pristine development company was forced into Chapter 7 liquidation bankruptcy. Valerie, systematically stripped of her country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, and her social standing, was subjected to total public disgrace. Their entire identity had been tied to an illusion of power, a facade as empty as their wallets, a psychological trap where they fundamentally confused material possession with inherent personal value. Once the stolen money was gone, they were exposed as utterly hollow individuals who possessed nothing of true worth. They had traded their integrity for assets they couldn't keep. 3 days after the final liens were successfully executed, my phone rang. It was Arthur. I answered, putting him on speakerphone while I calmly reviewed a new technical writing contract. His voice was broken, trembling, with a pathetic, desperate attempt at reconciliation. He offered a convoluted non-apology, citing the stress of business, the complexities of family dynamics, and his failing health. He asked if we could find a way to move past this, to heal the rift and be a family again. I listened to his excuses with absolute clinical detachment. The transaction was complete, and his emotional account was permanently overdrawn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't express a single ounce of anger. I simply told him that our relationship had always been a business arrangement, and I was officially closing the subsidiary. I calmly rejected his apology on equal, absolute terms, informing him that he no longer had a daughter and my children no longer had a grandfather. I hung up the phone and permanently blocked his number. The coastal wind outside my window sounded different that night. It no longer sounded like a freezing draft I had to endure. It sounded like a clean sweep, methodically clearing away the debris of a bankrupt legacy to make room for an entirely new foundation. 6 months later, the drafty attic above the marine supply shop is just a closed file in my archives. I relocated my family to a bright, spacious home on the coast. It features a wide, green yard and, most importantly, a massive oak kitchen table. It is a table where Faye, Della, and Beckett have their own permanent, comfortable seats. No one is ever relegated to a drafty hallway. No one ever has to wait for a turn to be acknowledged or fed. Martha stops by on weekends, bringing surplus baking and filling our massive kitchen with genuine, uncomplicated laughter. At night, I walk down the wide hallway and listen to my children sleeping soundly, no longer conditioned to check for locked doors or brace for the subtle, daily cruelties of conditional love. The trust fund is secure, meticulously managed, and legally fortified against any outside interference. I've come to realize that cutting toxic ties is not an act of malice. It is an act of absolute sovereignty. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free by simply walking away and closing the ledger. The clarity I gained felt structural, a solid foundation built on truth rather than manipulation. To those who carry the silent ache of familial exclusion, this is a letter to those who always feel on the edge. You do not have to accept a life on the periphery of someone else's ego, and your worth is not defined by those who are too blind to see it. The courage it takes to audit your own life, to permanently cancel the subscriptions to toxic relationships, is immense. But the peace that follows is profound and untouchable. I am no longer the outsider looking in. I am the architect of my own table, and every single seat is filled with love that doesn't have to be earned through silent submission. If this story resonated with your own journey of breaking free from toxic cycles, drop a comment below, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so we can continue building a community of truth and resilience together.